The scream shattered the heavy silence of the old Aldridge estate. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals, blanketing the Vermont countryside, but inside, the air was thick with heat, pain, and fear. Margaret gripped the edge of the brass bed frame, her knuckles white as her daughter Lucy cried out in the next room. A midwife barked instructions, her voice tremulous. Margaret knew this moment was coming. She had counted the days, watched the calendar like a bomb timer, and prayed against every tick. The prophecy, if it could be called that, had haunted her bloodline for over a century. She had buried the stories as a child, but now, with her daughter's labor echoing through the walls, they clawed their way back. She reached for the worn leather journal on the bedside table. Eleanor's journal passed from hand to hand like a relic too cursed to destroy. The pages trembled in her grip. "It begins when the child is born," read the last entry in faded ink. I felt it inside me, like something peeling away from my soul. Margaret's breath caught. The same words had echoed through generations. First Eleanor, then Vivian. Both women, bright, strong, loved, dead within hours of holding their first grandchild. Their deaths were never violent, never dramatic. They simply faded, as if something sacred had been taken from them. A cost paid in flesh. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed once, then twice. Margaret rose each step toward the birthing room, feeling like a descent into fate. Her body ached, her bones heavy with the weight of dread. The scent of lavender and old wood filled the hallway. Then, silence. No cries, no midwife's voice, no infant wail. "Lucy!" she called, her voice breaking. The door creaked open. Inside, Lucy lay pale and sweating, her hair clinging to her forehead. In her arms a small bundle stirred, its cry faint but alive. Margaret froze. Relief flooded her, but it didn't last. The midwife turned slowly. Her face bore the same expression Margaret remembered from her childhood when Vivian had died. A look of helpless reverence, as if standing before something ancient and unforgiving. "You have a granddaughter," the midwife whispered. "She's perfect." And then Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed the doorframe, dizzy. A sharp pain flared in her spine and vanished just as fast. Lucy looked up. "Mom." "I'm fine," Margaret lied. But she knew. She had hours, maybe less. Her heartbeat thudded louder than the wind outside. Her skin prickled. Somewhere deep within the mansion, a sound like distant weeping stirred. She turned to the hallway and saw it, just for a moment. A figure at the far end cloaked in shadow, long black hair trailing behind her like smoke. Not again. She turned back to Lucy and forced a smile. "She's beautiful," she said. "What will you name her?" Lucy hesitated. "I don't know yet. Maybe Eleanor?" Margaret's heart twisted. Eleanor. The beginning. The curse had come full circle. If you're hooked already, don't forget to subscribe for more twisted historical tales. The story of the Aldridge women is just beginning. What secrets lie buried beneath generations of grief? The Aldridge estate loomed in solemn silence, its gabled windows staring out like tired ancient eyes. Snow covered the grounds, but inside, the house breathed with warmth and unease. Margaret sat alone in the drawing room, firelight dancing over the carved oak panels. The journal lay open on her lap. Lucy was resting upstairs, the baby nestled in a bassinet, unaware of the legacy that hung over her like a veil. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped through the yellowed pages, each line of Eleanor's handwriting heavier than the last. She had read the journal before, of course, but not like this, not with death inching closer like a slow tide. The wind outside howled against the glass, but it was the sound within the house that made her shiver. Faint whispers, too soft to catch, always vanishing when she turned her head. The house had always whispered. As a girl, she'd thought it was her imagination. As a woman, she knew better. She stood, heart pounding, and walked down the hallway toward the old library. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Dust hung in the air like memory. Shelves towered around her, filled with leather-bound volumes no one had touched in decades. In the corner, behind a heavy armchair, sat a small chest she didn't recognize. She knelt and pried it open. Inside, carefully wrapped in silk, was a second journal, this one far older. The first page bore the name Eleanor Aldridge, but the handwriting was different, tighter, rushed, ink smudged, as if it had been written in hiding. "The pattern cannot be coincidence," the entry began. "3 women, 3 deaths, always after the child is born." Margaret flipped forward, scanning for dates. 1853. That was the year Eleanor had died. "My husband believes I'm losing my mind, but I have seen her, the woman with black hair. She watches me. She waits." Margaret's breath caught. Her gaze shifted to the darkened hallway behind her, the silence pressing in like weight. Back upstairs, Lucy stirred. The baby began to cry. Margaret hurried back, but her thoughts stayed in the library, circling the words over and over. She knew now that Eleanor had suspected something far beyond coincidence, that her death wasn't just misfortune or postpartum tragedy, and Margaret wasn't sure what was worse, that the curse was real or that it had been ignored for generations. She spent the next hours moving through the house like a ghost, lighting lamps, touching familiar walls. The portraits in the corridor seemed to watch her, stern faces of Aldridge ancestors, their eyes hollowed by shadow. None of the women hung there, only men. Fathers, sons, patriarchs. The women had vanished from canvas as they had from life. A slow ache grew behind her eyes. In the parlor, the ticking of the clock grew louder. She picked up a family Bible from the mantel and leafed through the genealogy pages. There it was again. Eleanor Aldridge, died 1853. Vivian Aldridge, died 1910. Claire Aldridge, died 1934. Each followed by the birth of a grandchild, each name paired with silence. Margaret's own name waited there now, blank beside it. The walls whispered again, this time closer. She turned sharply. Nothing. But something had changed in the air. A presence, maybe. Or just the truth finally settling over her. Either way, she felt it in her bones. Something old, something hungry. And the house, the damned Aldridge house, had kept it safe all these years. If you're still with us, the mystery is only deepening. What did Eleanor truly discover in those final days? Stay close. The secrets are buried deeper than anyone imagined. The year was 1853. The air hung thick with the scent of pine and oil lamps, and the Aldridge estate, though young in its years, already bore the weight of secrets. Eleanor Aldridge paced the library floor, her silk skirts brushing against the carpet as she clutched a small book bound in burgundy leather. She had barely slept in days. Her eyes, once radiant with sharp intellect, were now rimmed red from reading and fear. She had traced it carefully. 3 names, 3 women, 3 deaths. Each after giving birth to a child who would later bear the Aldridge name into a new generation. But it wasn't childbirth that stole their lives. It was something else. Something that came afterward. Something that watched. "Samuel," she called, her voice trembling. Her husband sat by the fire, polishing his spectacles with a cloth. A man of science, Samuel Aldridge had little patience for superstition. "I don't have time for your dreams tonight, Eleanor," he muttered, without looking up. She walked closer, her knuckles white around the book. "This isn't a dream. It's a pattern. Your mother, my sister-in-law, and now me." He sighed. "You've let confinement rattle your nerves." "I'm not hysterical," she snapped. "I know what I've seen, the woman, the dark figure near the nursery, the mirror cracked without reason." Samuel stood now, towering over her. "We're respected people, Eleanor. Aldridges do not traffic in ghosts and curses. You shame yourself." She recoiled. "And what if I die tomorrow? Will you still pretend there's nothing wrong?" He stared at her, his jaw tight. "You won't die. You'll recover and you'll be silent." She turned and walked away, tears burning her cheeks. The fire crackled behind her, but no warmth reached her bones. Later that night, she sat alone in her chamber, writing by candlelight. "I must leave something behind," she scribbled. "If I am wrong, then this will fade. But if I am right, God forgive me. Someone must know." The candle flickered. She paused, her heart pounding. A whisper, soft as silk, passed through the room. She turned sharply. Nothing. Only the creaking of the floorboards and the soft ticking of the wall clock. She pressed the pen harder. I have seen her. In the mirror, in the window, in the cradle's shadow. She waits. I feel her. As the candle died, Eleanor laid the pen down, her breath shallow. By morning she was gone. The midwife found her still, eyes open, a faint smile on her lips. In her hand was the journal, ink still fresh. On the last page, a single line written in shaking letters. She comes when the bloodline bends. Samuel never spoke of it. He buried her in the family plot and burned half the books in the library. The rest he locked away. Her journal vanished. Rumors swirled among the staff, but they too were dismissed or replaced. But Eleanor had planted something, a seed. Her words would not die with her. Years later, a young woman, Vivian Aldridge, would find an old book hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Its cover was cracked, its pages brittle, but her name was there, and so was her grandmother's. And Eleanor's dying words would begin to whisper again. The past never stays buried. What Eleanor tried to warn could have saved generations, if only someone had listened. In the shadows of truth, someone is always watching. The year was 1910, and the Aldridge name still carried weight in Vermont society. But inside the estate, beneath its ivy-clad elegance and polished silver, something darker stirred, something that whispered through generations. Vivian Aldridge had always been peculiar, artistic, sensitive. She saw things others did not, and felt things others chose to ignore. Her paintings, vibrant and strange, often unsettled guests. But her charm, her laughter, her haunting blue eyes, those things made it easy to forgive her eccentricities, until the birth of her niece. Vivian was 23 when her older sister Elizabeth delivered a daughter. The night of the birth, Vivian had stayed awake, sitting by the window with a brush in her hand and Eleanor's old journal resting open beside her. She hadn't painted all week. Her hands had trembled too much. Now something inside her had shifted. The candlelight flickered and she dipped her brush in red. By dawn, the canvas revealed a woman standing in shadow, long black hair draped over her shoulders, face blurred like a smear of fog. Behind her, a cradle. Inside, nothing. Vivian dropped the brush. Her knees gave out. The painting stared back, unfinished but alive. Elizabeth died 3 hours later. At the funeral, Vivian said nothing. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth tight. When her father asked if she was all right, she smiled and said, "She's still watching." That was the beginning. Within days, she stopped sleeping. She locked herself in her room, tearing through old trunks, searching for Eleanor's words. The journal she'd found as a child now consumed her. She read and reread passages by lamplight, muttering lines aloud. She comes when the bloodline bends. Vivian painted every day, the same figure, over and over, each portrait darker than the last. Sometimes the woman wept, sometimes she screamed, sometimes her eyes bled. The family called a doctor. He prescribed rest, tinctures, silence. But Vivian couldn't stop. One morning, a servant found her standing barefoot in the snow, whispering to the trees. Her nightgown was soaked, her hands purple. When they brought her inside, she laughed and said, "She lives beneath the floor. I heard her breathing." Her father, desperate and ashamed, arranged for her admittance to Willow Creek Sanitarium. She never resisted. At Willow Creek, Vivian filled notebook after notebook with drawings and words. Nurses began to fear her. She refused food, claiming the woman in black told her not to eat. One nurse reported Vivian spoke in a voice that was not her own. Another swore she saw Vivian sleepwalk into the hallway and stare at her for an hour without blinking. The doctors diagnosed hysteria, melancholia, early schizophrenia. They ignored her warnings. "The cradle is never empty. The matron sees to that." They dismissed the name, but it would come again. In her final year, Vivian painted one last piece, a self-portrait, though her features were distorted, half her face shadowed, the other lit by a flickering flame. Behind her stood the woman again, hand on Vivian's shoulder, eyes wide and endless. When the orderlies entered her room the next morning, Vivian was gone. The windows were locked, the door barred from the inside. On the wall above the bed, written in charcoal, were 4 words. "She took me home." They never found her body. The painting vanished, but the whispers began again. Every generation thought they could silence her, dismiss her, lock her away. But what Vivian saw, what she painted, would return, and the matron was far from done. The nursery was warm, filled with the scent of linen and baby powder. Soft sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the floor. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something in the room didn't belong. Lucy was resting in the adjoining bedroom. The baby, her granddaughter, slept peacefully in the cradle Eleanor once used. Everything looked serene, normal. But Margaret had learned long ago that the house could wear a mask. It began with whispers. At first they were faint, like wind slipping through the walls. Then came the dreams. Margaret saw herself standing in a black corridor, the sound of a cradle rocking somewhere in the dark. She would reach for it, heart thudding, only to awaken before touching the child. 3 nights in a row, the same dream. On the 4th night, Lucy called out. Margaret ran to her room and found her daughter standing barefoot by the window, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. "She's in the garden," Lucy whispered. "She watches from the tree." Margaret pulled her close. "Who, sweetheart?" Lucy blinked. "The woman with the long hair. She said her name is Matron." Margaret's blood ran cold. That name, Vivian had written it. Eleanor had hinted at it, but no one had spoken it aloud in decades. The next morning, Margaret returned to the library. She flipped through the journals, desperate for something more. That's when she saw it, a sketch tucked between pages. Drawn in pencil, hastily and with shaking hands, it showed a tall figure in a black dress, her face obscured by strands of hair. Behind her stood a cradle, and in the cradle, nothing. Below the sketch, in small, trembling letters, "She waits for the firstborn of the firstborn." Margaret paced the room, heart racing. She needed answers. She needed history. She drove into town, to the local archives. After hours of sifting through dust and silence, she found a mention of the Aldridge family in an old county journal. One article, dated 1851, caught her attention. Dispute over land inheritance following the tragic loss of Agnes Holloway's child. Rumors of scandal surrounding the Aldridge patriarch, Samuel Aldridge, no charges filed. Margaret frowned. The Holloway name stirred something in her. She made a note and returned home. That night the baby wouldn't stop crying. Lucy rocked her, humming softly, but the infant wailed as if in pain. Margaret took the child, whispering comfort. Then she saw it, just beyond the nursery door, a woman, tall, motionless. Her black dress rippled as though caught in a breeze that didn't touch anything else in the room. Her hair hung forward, veiling her face, and yet Margaret felt her stare like ice on her skin. She didn't move, didn't breathe, and then she was gone. Margaret sank into the rocking chair, trembling. The baby fell silent in her arms. Later that night, Lucy approached, her face pale. "I drew her," she said, handing Margaret a folded piece of paper. The charcoal sketch was unmistakable. The same figure from the journals, the same face from the forgotten painting, the matron. Margaret folded the drawing and placed it beside Eleanor's journal. "She's real," Lucy whispered. "Isn't she?" Margaret nodded slowly. "She's real. And she's not finished." The face has appeared. The whispers are louder. And now the past is clawing its way back into the present. What ties the Aldridge name to this haunting figure? The year was 1850, and the Aldridge name commanded power. Samuel Aldridge was a man of influence, wealthy, educated, and deeply respected. But beneath his composed exterior lay a man consumed by secrets, driven by pride and desire. Agnes Holloway was unlike anyone Samuel had ever known. She lived alone at the edge of the forest, a healer with knowledge passed down through generations. People called her gifted, others called her cursed. But to Samuel, she was irresistible. Their affair began in whispers and shadows, late-night visits, hidden letters. Agnes, with her raven-black hair and eyes like storm clouds, held a fire Samuel could never tame. But when Agnes became pregnant, everything changed. She expected him to keep his promises, to leave his wife, to acknowledge their child. Samuel recoiled. The scandal, the disgrace, the threat to his lineage, it was unthinkable. Instead, he accused her of witchcraft. He used his influence, summoned witnesses, fabricated evidence. He claimed she had bewitched him, used herbs and potions to corrupt his mind. Townspeople, already wary of Agnes's talents, turned on her swiftly. She was dragged from her home in the middle of the night, her hut burned, her remedies destroyed. Her child, a son, was taken, hidden away by a midwife who defied Samuel's orders. Agnes was sentenced without trial. On the day of her execution, the townspeople gathered in silence. She stood tall, unafraid, her eyes fixed on Samuel. "You fear what you don't understand," she said, "but you should fear what you've awakened." Samuel said nothing. Before the rope tightened, Agnes spoke her final words, not in English but in an older tongue. Her voice echoed with a force no wind could carry. "Your womb shall birth death until one breaks the bloodline." Many laughed, others shivered. Samuel turned away, but nothing was ever the same. Within months, his wife, Rachel Aldridge, fell ill. She died shortly after giving birth to their daughter, Eleanor. Doctors called it fever. Some whispered of poison, but Samuel said nothing. He buried Rachel beside the garden. He locked away every trace of Agnes from the estate. The name Holloway was struck from records. Her hut never rebuilt, but the land remembered. And so did the blood. Eleanor grew up in that house, shadowed by grief and silence. She knew little of her mother, even less of Agnes. Samuel never spoke of the past, but the forest whispered, the wind called. As Eleanor became a woman, the same darkness began to coil around her. Visions, dreams, whispers, and when she gave birth to her daughter, the circle began again. She died, as Rachel had. As would others after her. The curse had found its rhythm. Each firstborn daughter lived long enough to give life, but not to witness it grow. The first grandchild signaled their end, a toll exacted in flesh. And always the shadow lingered, the matron. They would come to call her that in time, a name born from fear and repetition. She was not Agnes. She was what remained when vengeance took root in the soul, a creation of anguish, wrath, and bloodline betrayal. And she would not be satisfied until the debt was paid. A lie buried in fear, a love betrayed, a curse cast in fury. The origin has been unearthed, but its reach stretches through generations. Can the truth bring salvation, or will it only deepen the wound? The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of dead grass and forgotten stone. Margaret stood in the Aldridge cemetery, the cold wind tugging at her coat. Rows of headstones stretched before her, generations etched in granite. But she wasn't looking for what was marked. She was searching for what was hidden. She held a tattered piece of parchment in her gloved hand. It had been tucked inside Eleanor's second journal, wedged behind a loose board in the library. It wasn't a confession. It was a map. Margaret followed the markings beyond the cemetery's iron fence, into the woods behind the property. The trees stood bare, skeletal. She moved slowly, breath visible in the air. Then she saw it, a mound, barely discernible, covered in ivy and moss. She dropped to her knees and began digging. The earth was hard, reluctant to give, but she pressed on. An hour passed. Then her hand struck metal, a small door, rusted but intact. She pulled it open and descended into darkness. The crypt was narrow, the ceiling low. A single lantern, long extinguished, lay in the corner. Margaret lit her own and stepped forward. At the center stood a stone coffin. Unlike the others, it bore no name. Only a single word carved roughly across the lid. Agnes. Margaret's throat tightened. She brushed off the dirt and dust, revealing strange symbols etched along the stone, markings that didn't match any language she knew. Inside the coffin lay not bones, but relics, a lock of jet-black hair bound in a red ribbon, a silver pendant, tarnished, a bundle of herbs long dried but still aromatic, and beneath it all a page written in the same spidery script from Eleanor's journal. The matron is not a ghost. She is grief bound to form. Her tether is blood, and her strength lies in silence. But silence can be broken. Margaret stepped back, heart hammering. Everything she feared was real. And more, there was purpose behind it. Intention. A consciousness in the curse. The matron wasn't haunting them, she was punishing them. The moment Margaret emerged from the crypt, the wind shifted. It wasn't loud, but it was immediate. A pressure in the air. The trees groaned. That night, the house came alive. Windows slammed, lights flickered. The baby wailed, inconsolable. Margaret rushed to the nursery and found Lucy crouched in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was in the mirror, Lucy whispered, eyes wide. I saw her. She walked through it. Margaret held her daughter tightly, trying to steady her own breath. Later, she returned to the crypt in her mind, replaying what she had read. The matron is grief bound to form. She understood now. The curse wasn't just vengeance, it was a wound that never closed, passed down like inheritance, strengthened by denial, fed by every silence and every lie. And it had grown. That night, Margaret dreamed of a fire burning in the woods. She stood beside the cradle, but this time, the baby was gone. In its place was a single red ribbon. She awoke with a scream. Down the hall, a mirror had cracked from corner to corner, and in its reflection, for a fleeting second, the matron watched, proof buried in dirt, a name carved in silence. And a force that feeds on what is not spoken. The Aldridge legacy is unraveling, and the line between memory and haunting is fading. Margaret sat in the study, the air around her thick with dust and unanswered questions. The pendant from the crypt lay on the desk, next to Eleanor's journal and the bundle of herbs. She didn't know what to make of it anymore. Was this supernatural? Psychological? Both? Her world, once governed by logic, was now slipping into something else entirely. She needed help. Dr. Henry Blackwell wasn't her first choice. A professor of medicine and folklore at the State University, he had a reputation for dismantling legends with brutal precision. He was precise, skeptical, unshakable. But that was what she needed, someone to test what was real. She called him that morning. By afternoon he was there. Henry was tall, sharply dressed, and utterly unreadable. He listened as Margaret recounted everything. Eleanor's journal, Vivian's madness, the matron, the crypt. When she finished, he asked only one question. Have you experienced hallucinations? Margaret laughed bitterly. Is that what you think this is? I think trauma can echo through generations, but I'm not here to dismiss you, I'm here to investigate. She showed him the items, the journal, the herbs, the drawing Lucy had made. He examined them carefully. This blend, he said, holding the dried herbs close to his nose, is a variation of rue, wormwood, and vervain, traditional purifiers. Used in many cultures to ward off spirits. So Eleanor wasn't imagining things, Margaret said. She believed something was happening. That matters. They moved to the crypt that afternoon. Henry knelt by the coffin, studying the symbols. These aren't just random carvings. They resemble a hybrid of early New England protective sigils and Old English runes. This wasn't decorative. It was containment. Containment? Margaret echoed. Yes, not for keeping people out, but keeping something in. Henry's skepticism began to waver. That night he stayed in the estate. At 3:17 a.m. he awoke to a sound, like humming, a woman's voice. He followed it down the hall past the nursery. The song was old, familiar and foreign. It stopped as he reached the mirror outside the guest room. In its reflection he saw her, black dress, hanging hair, pale hands reaching forward, and then nothing. The next morning, Henry was quiet, paler, but more determined. This isn't hysteria, he said. There's a pattern, a transfer of energy, trauma, or call it spirit if you must, something that awakens with the birth of a grandchild, something that feeds. He opened Eleanor's journal again. Several entries mentioned a tincture, one Eleanor had been working on, trying to sever the blood tether. She believed this curse was biological and spiritual, Henry explained, and that a counter-agent might exist, something to interrupt the inheritance. Margaret nodded slowly. So how do we make it? Henry stood. We follow Eleanor's notes. We find the ingredients. We try. But as he gathered his satchel, a loud crash echoed through the hall. A mirror had shattered. The baby cried out. Margaret rushed upstairs. Lucy held the child, her eyes filled with panic. She was in the glass, Lucy whispered. She touched the baby's hand. Henry checked the child. No injuries, no fever. Just a deep, unnatural silence once the crying stopped. The time is running out, he said. If Eleanor's ritual failed, we'll need to understand why, and soon. Margaret felt the weight of it all pressing down. Generations of silence, one final chance to break it. The matron was closer now, hungrier, and Margaret wasn't ready to die. Belief bends when evidence bleeds through doubt. What began as legend now stands in science's shadow, and the line between cure and curse is vanishing fast. The room smelled of ash and ancient dust. Candles flickered along the edges of the old stone basement beneath the Aldridge estate, an area unused for decades, its walls lined with forgotten furniture and rusted tools. Margaret stood at the center, holding Eleanor's journal open to the page marked with dried blood and ink. Henry knelt nearby, carefully mixing the tincture. The ingredients had been difficult to gather. Some they'd found in the local apothecary, others, like the herbs from Agnes's grave. They had retrieved themselves, hands shaking as they dug through earth and time. This has to be done before the third night, Henry said. The journal's clear. After that, the bond strengthens. Margaret nodded, gripping the vial tightly. She came last night. She touched the baby. Henry looked up. Then we don't have time. They had prepared a circle of salt, symbols chalked on the ground using Eleanor's original sketches. At its center sat the pendant from the crypt and the lock of black hair, both trembling without wind. They poured the tincture over the items, and the reaction was immediate. A hiss, a shudder in the ground. Henry whispered the incantation. Not Latin, not English, something older. Margaret held her breath. Then the candles died all at once. Darkness swallowed the room. A low moan echoed from the walls, followed by the sound of fabric dragging across stone. Margaret's skin prickled. She's here, she whispered. From the far end of the basement, a figure emerged, not fully visible, only glimpsed between blinks. Black hair, stretched fingers, hollow eyes. The matron did not move like a person. She flickered like a memory refusing to fade. Henry continued the chant, louder now, his voice shaking. The circle pulsed. A wind rose from nowhere, swirling around them. The matron stepped forward. Margaret felt a pressure behind her eyes, like something trying to push in. Her knees buckled, but she didn't break the circle. Henry grabbed her wrist. "Don't move," he shouted. The matron screamed. Not loud, not human. A sound like every mourning mother compressed into a single wail. The walls cracked. The air thickened. The pendant began to glow, but then, from upstairs, a scream. Lucy. The baby. Margaret broke. She stepped from the circle. "No!" Henry shouted, reaching for her. But it was too late. The wind stopped. The candles reignited on their own. The matron vanished. The ritual had been severed. Margaret ran. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heart hammering, every footstep louder than thunder in her ears. The nursery door was ajar. Lucy sat on the floor, cradling the baby, shaking violently. "She was here," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. She stood over the crib. "I couldn't move." The baby whimpered, small, frightened, but alive. Margaret sank to the floor, wrapping them both in her arms. Henry arrived moments later, face pale, breath ragged. "It was working," he said, "but it needed time." Margaret looked up. "I couldn't leave her alone. I had to—" "I know," he said quietly. "But now she knows we're trying to stop her. She won't be subtle anymore." They sat in silence, the weight of failure pressing on them. The matron had been summoned, and now the clock had started again. The ritual failed, the circle broken, and the matron's wrath has only begun to awaken. Now that she knows they resist, she will not rest. What price will they pay for interruption? Rain fell in sheets against the windows, drumming like an ancient rhythm. Margaret sat beside Lucy's bed, holding her daughter's hand as waves of pain coursed through her body. The baby was coming, early, unexpected. No doctors, no hospital, just them and the storm. Henry moved quickly, boiling water, gathering cloth, doing what he could. He had trained in medicine, yes, but never under such circumstances. The journal lay open nearby, the pages soaked from Margaret's earlier dash through the storm. The ink had begun to bleed. Lucy screamed again. The air grew colder. Margaret looked up. The light in the hallway flickered once, twice, then failed. "She's here," she whispered. Henry tightened his grip on the cloth. "We finish this." Lucy gasped, crying out with each contraction. Her breath came in short, broken bursts. Margaret pressed a wet cloth to her forehead, whispering words she barely believed anymore. The room darkened. Not a power outage. Something deeper, the kind of dark that swallowed sound. And then, through the hallway mirror, she appeared. The matron, still, watching. Her hands hovered inches above the glass, her face a blur of sorrow and rage. Margaret turned, shielding Lucy with her body. "Leave her!" she shouted. The matron didn't move, but the cradle began to rock on its own, slow, deliberate. Henry gritted his teeth. "We have to end this, now." With one final push, Lucy cried out, her voice raw and primal. Then silence, a child's cry. A girl. Margaret wept, holding the child in trembling arms. Blood ran across the linens, mixing with tears and sweat and fear. The baby's eyes blinked open, unaware of the legacy that waited to devour her. Lucy lay back, eyes fluttering. "Is she—" "She's perfect," Margaret said, voice breaking. "You did it." For a moment it felt real. Peace. Then Margaret collapsed, her vision narrowed, her limbs turned cold. Henry caught her before she hit the floor. "No," he said, "not yet, don't do this." Margaret's heart pounded slower, her breath shallow. Then, a shift. She stood, not physically, but as if lifted from her body. The room faded. She was elsewhere, a place of mist and echo. Before her stood the matron, not distant now, but close. Her face was no longer obscured. It was Agnes, younger than Margaret expected, eyes full of pain, but not hate. "So you saw me," Agnes said. "You heard them, and you came anyway." "I had to," Margaret replied. "I couldn't let her die." Agnes stepped forward. "You broke the pattern. You fought." "Then is it over?" Agnes reached for her. Margaret felt warmth flood her chest. Memories, voices, generations of women echoing in her ears. And one final whisper. She must know her name. Margaret gasped and opened her eyes. She was back. Alive. Lucy sobbed beside her, clutching the child. "You stopped breathing." Margaret sat up, weak but whole. Henry looked stunned. "That's not possible." But it was. The matron was gone. No whispers, no cracked mirrors, no chill in the walls. Only the steady sound of a newborn's breath and the wind shifting above the roof. Margaret reached for the baby and held her close. "She must know her name," she murmured. "Her true name." Lucy smiled faintly. "What is it?" Margaret kissed the child's forehead. "Eleanor." A name reborn. A curse interrupted. For the first time in generations, a mother held her grandchild and lived to see morning. But some debts don't die so easily, and peace must be guarded. The days that followed were quiet, eerily so. The house, once alive with whispers and breaking glass, now felt hollow, as if something enormous had exhaled and vanished. But Margaret knew better than to trust silence. She watched the baby sleep, her chest rising and falling in rhythm. Eleanor Holloway Aldridge. The name carried both weight and possibility. Lucy had accepted it without hesitation, but Margaret couldn't rest. The vision, Agnes's face, her words, haunted her. She must know her name. There was more, something unresolved, The matron may have vanished, but the wound she represented was deeper than death. Henry returned with old parish records. "I found something," he said. After Agnes Holloway was executed, there were rumors her child survived, hidden, raised by a midwife. Margaret leaned in. "Do we know who?" "I traced the name through several false entries. Eventually it reappears in the 1870 census as a young girl, Sarah Holloway, living with a healer in the neighboring town of Lichfield." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That name!" "There's a Holloway in Lichfield now. She's a midwife." Henry nodded. "Her name is Evelyn, and she's Agnes's descendant." The next morning they drove to Lichfield. Evelyn Holloway lived in a weathered cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by wild herbs and climbing vines. Her face was lined with years, but her eyes were alert, sharp. "I wondered when someone would come," she said, before Margaret even spoke. Margaret froze. "You know who I am?" "You carry the Aldridge grief like a cloak," Evelyn replied, gesturing for them to sit. "It's in your face, in your silence." Henry explained what they had uncovered, the ritual, the visions, the girl. Evelyn listened, hands folded. "My grandmother told me stories," she began, "of a woman whose rage cracked the veil between life and death. But rage is not a curse. It's the echo of justice denied." Margaret leaned forward. "We broke the pattern. I lived. The baby lived. But it still feels unfinished." "Because it is," Evelyn said softly. "The Aldridges tried to erase us, bury us, but the blood remembers. The curse only ever existed because both lines were severed. The healing begins when they unite." Margaret hesitated. "How?" "Through acknowledgement, through bond. The matron needed to be seen, yes, but Agnes's blood needs to be accepted." Evelyn stood and retrieved a small vial from a wooden cabinet. Inside was a pale, translucent oil. "This was made from herbs only grown near the Holloway line," she said. "My family has preserved it for generations. It's not magic, it's memory. You anoint the child and speak her name, both names, yours and mine." Margaret's voice trembled. "A ceremony?" "A pact," Evelyn corrected. "Not with the dead, with the living." That evening, beneath a setting sun, Evelyn stood beside Margaret and Lucy in the Aldridge garden. No mirrors cracked, no chill filled the air, just wind and warmth and breath. Margaret held the baby and looked at Evelyn. "You're sure?" Evelyn nodded. "When we honor what was erased, the shadow fades." Margaret dipped her fingers into the oil and touched the baby's brow. "Eleanor Holloway Aldridge," she whispered, "you are of both." For a heartbeat the wind stopped. The air thickened and then something passed, like smoke dissolving into light. The baby opened her eyes and smiled. "Two lines once torn now begin to mend. The blood has been acknowledged. But even in unity, memory lingers." What does peace look like after a century of silence? The moon hung low over the Aldridge estate, casting long silver shadows across the garden. The air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, but changed. Margaret stood by the window, watching the wind move through the branches, trying to understand what peace might feel like after generations of dread. Inside, Evelyn Holloway walked the halls of the mansion with steady purpose. She paused before each doorway, touching the wood as if feeling for echoes. Lucy watched her with cautious eyes, still uncertain what all of this meant. "She's not like anyone I've ever met," Lucy whispered to Margaret. "She carries something old," Margaret replied, "but not dangerous, just honest." They gathered in the drawing room just before midnight. Henry stood at the edge, observing, silent but alert. The baby lay in a cradle woven with ivy, the pendant from the crypt now hanging above it. No one had seen the matron since the anointing, but no one trusted absence as proof of safety. Evelyn knelt before the child and placed both palms gently on the sides of the cradle. Her lips moved in silence. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she felt them like a vibration in the bones. Then Evelyn looked up. "This house remembers," she said softly. "And so does she." Margaret approached, hesitant. "What happens now?" "The pact isn't just made once," Evelyn said. "It has to be kept. The stories must be told, the names remembered. If they are forgotten again, so will the cost return. Lucy stepped forward. You're saying the curse was sustained by silence? Yes, Evelyn nodded. Every lie, every erasure. Every time your family erased what they feared, it grew stronger. That's how grief turns into something else. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She remembered Samuel, Eleanor, Vivian, all of them trapped in patterns never broken because no one had dared speak the full truth. Lucy looked to the cradle. So we tell her everything. As soon as she can understand, Evelyn said. You tell her about Agnes, about Eleanor, about both names she carries, and she'll never be alone in it. Henry stepped forward then, breaking his quiet. And the matron, he asked. She's gone? Evelyn's expression turned thoughtful. She's at rest, but not gone. She was never meant to be destroyed, only heard. Margaret placed her hand over her granddaughter's heart. Then we'll listen. And make sure she never has to scream again. Outside the wind shifted again, gentler this time. No chill, no whisper, just air moving through the trees like breath. That night, Lucy sat with Evelyn in the kitchen, learning the blend of herbs used for the oil. She took notes, asked questions, and began to see the work ahead not as fear, but as guardianship. Margaret returned to the library. She opened the drawer where the journals lay, pulled out Eleanor's original, and placed it beside her own. She began to write. Not warnings, not fear, but names, stories, connections. It was not just the end of a curse, it was the beginning of memory. Before leaving, Evelyn pressed something into Margaret's hand, a ring, silver, and etched with 2 letters interwoven, A and H. Pass it on, she said. Margaret held it tightly. Thank you. Evelyn smiled. We're family, even if they tried to forget. And as the Holloway woman disappeared into the woods, Margaret stood on the porch with the child in her arms, whispering her name once more, not out of fear, but to remind the world, this child belongs to all who came before. One family's silence nearly cost them everything. But now a story long buried is being told again, word by word, name by name. Some spirits fade when remembered. Morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, warming the floorboards of a house long accustomed to cold. For the first time in living memory, the Aldridge estate stood still, not from fear but from rest. No cracked mirrors, no shadows where they shouldn't be. Just silence, natural and unburdened. Margaret awoke slowly, her body sore but whole. The lingering ache in her chest was not illness, it was memory settling. She moved through the hall with careful steps, glancing toward the nursery. Lucy sat by the window, nursing Eleanor. The child cooed softly, eyes wide and alert. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched for a long moment. How do you feel? Lucy asked. Like I was supposed to be gone, Margaret said, then smiled. But I'm still here. Lucy nodded. I've been waiting for something to happen. I keep expecting the lights to flicker or the air to turn cold again. Margaret stepped into the room. It's quiet because we listened. Downstairs, Henry had begun compiling their research. He had drawn maps, copied entries from the journals, and catalogued Agnes Holloway's ritual into something academic, structured. He wasn't trying to exploit it. He wanted to preserve it as warning and record. What had once seemed superstition had proven to be legacy, and legacy deserved context. Later that day, Margaret and Henry stood by the hearth, sipping tea. I checked the mirror in the hall, he said. No cracks. And the nursery? Still. He looked thoughtful. It's strange. Most curses, in stories, I mean, they demand sacrifice. But this one demanded recognition. Margaret nodded. It was never about blood, it was about being forgotten. Henry placed a worn book on the table. I looked into other families, by the way. Similar cases. Women dying after childbirth. Generational misfortunes. But they all faded before the 3rd generation. And ours lasted 5, Margaret said. Because yours tried hardest to erase it. That truth landed heavily. The silence was broken by laughter upstairs. Eleanor's soft giggle. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. The days passed with no sign of the matron. The shadows behaved. The house, long a container of pain, now held breath and sound and life. But Margaret didn't forget. One afternoon, she walked alone to the family cemetery. The path was muddy from spring rains, the trees just beginning to bud. She stopped before a blank headstone, one that had always stood near Eleanor's and Vivian's, never engraved. She knelt and pressed her palm to the stone. "For Agnes," she whispered, "and all of them." She had the name etched the following week, Agnes Holloway, 1827–1850, and beneath it, "She was never lost, only hidden." Lucy watched from a distance as the stonemason worked. "You think she would have stayed if someone had done this sooner?" she asked later. Margaret shook her head. She didn't want to stay. She just wanted someone to say her name without fear. They walked back in silence, the wind soft around them. No voices, no mourning, just the rhythm of footsteps and the weight of something lifting. The house welcomed them home. The matron is gone, but the echoes remain, gentle, not violent. This is what it means to survive the story and begin writing another. But memory must never become silence again. The journal lay open beneath the lamplight, its spine worn, pages crowded with names and dates, sketches and margins filled with notes. Margaret dipped her pen in ink and paused, staring at the blank sheet before her. There were no more warnings to write, no desperate pleas, only memory and a future that might finally unfold unburdened. She began with a date, then a name. Eleanor Holloway Aldridge. Born in peace, marked by love. She wrote slowly, deliberately, letting the ink settle like truth on paper. Her words weren't meant to frighten, they were meant to preserve. No more secrecy, no more silence passed down like heirloom poison. Upstairs, Lucy read to the baby, something light, something joyful. Margaret could hear her voice echo faintly through the old wood of the house. For once the sound didn't haunt, it comforted. She turned to a fresh page. What we carry is not a curse, it is responsibility. We name what came before not to awaken it, but to honor it. Agnes was never a monster. She was made one by those who feared her truth. Margaret paused, remembering her own mother, the confusion, the half-spoken stories, the strange looks at family gatherings, the way no one ever mentioned Vivian. They had all lived under the shadow, but now there was light. She continued writing. We tried to destroy what we didn't understand, and so it lingered. But grief has shape, rage has memory, and love, when denied, will echo until it's answered. Margaret closed the book gently. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a new portrait, one Lucy had commissioned, not of Margaret or the baby, but of three women, Eleanor, Vivian, Agnes, together, framed in light. Below them, a plaque read, "We listened." That evening, Lucy approached Margaret as the sun dipped low beyond the trees. "I've been thinking about moving," she said. "Not far, but somewhere smaller." "Quieter," Margaret nodded. "I understand. But I want to leave something behind, something for the next woman who walks these halls." She led Margaret to the nursery, where a small wooden box rested on a shelf beside the cradle. Inside were copies of every journal entry, every record of the Holloway line, and the ritual Evelyn had taught them. Margaret smiled. "You've turned memory into legacy." Lucy closed the lid. "No more hidden doors. If someone wants to know, it's here." Margaret reached into her pocket and handed her the silver ring Evelyn had given her, the one with the intertwined initials. Lucy held it up to the light. "It's beautiful." "She said it belongs to the one who understands both names," Margaret said. Lucy slipped it on. "It fits." That night Margaret sat by the fireplace one last time. She took the oldest of the journals, Eleanor's, and opened it to the first page. She traced the faded ink, then closed it gently. She placed it back in the drawer with the rest, but this time she left the drawer unlocked. In the hallway a single mirror remained. It reflected only what was there. No figures, no shadows. Just light and stillness. When the story is written down, it cannot be forgotten, and when names are spoken in truth, the ghosts behind them can finally rest. but stories live on through those willing to carry them forward. 20 years passed. The Aldridge estate stood much as it always had, weathered by time, cloaked in ivy, quiet. But inside, it was no longer heavy with sorrow. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways, mingling with music and stories. The nursery had become a study. The mirrors, once shrouded in cloth, now reflected nothing but light and motion. Eleanor Holloway Aldridge had grown into a thoughtful, curious woman. Her presence was calm but firm. She asked questions no one else dared. She touched every book, every artifact her grandmother and mother had preserved. And she remembered. She remembered everything. Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep just after Eleanor's 16th birthday. Lucy held her hand until the end, and later read aloud from the final entry of the journal they'd completed together. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like continuation. Eleanor, now 20, stood before the mirror at the end of the hallway, the same one where the matron had once appeared. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply stood and waited. Nothing came, but she smiled anyway. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked the garden path toward the family cemetery. The trees were full, the wind warm. At the center stood the stone marked with Agnes's name. She knelt beside it and placed a fresh sprig of vervain at the base. "You're still part of us," she said. "Not forgotten, not buried, just named." She rose and looked back toward the house. 3 generations of women had lived there, each breaking something, each rebuilding a little more. Inside the study, Eleanor unwrapped an old canvas. It had survived floods, fire, and time. The image was faded but clear enough. A woman in black, a cradle behind her. And in the shadow, a figure reaching toward her, unafraid. She took it down from the wall and painted over it. Not to erase, to reclaim. Later that evening, as the house settled and dusk fell, Lucy joined her daughter in the library. "I've been thinking of selling the estate," Lucy said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "It's okay. The story isn't in the walls anymore." Lucy smiled. "Where is it then?" Eleanor gestured to the shelves. "In the words, in us." They stood in silence, the fire crackling behind them. At the front of the house, a framed photograph sat on the mantel, Margaret, Lucy, and Eleanor, standing beneath the same tree where Agnes had once been condemned. 3 generations who lived. 3 who listened and remembered. As the fire dimmed, Eleanor added a new entry to the journal, a final one. "The house has gone still, not silent, just still. And in that stillness, I find no fear, I find memory, and I carry it with gratitude." The story continues, but not as a warning, as a song. Outside, the wind rose gently through the trees. No wails, no cries, just a breeze. And a name carried softly. Eleanor. Thank you for joining this journey through bloodlines, secrets, and survival. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep and lasting, subscribe to the channel for more tales that linger long after the final word. And don't stop now. Click on the next story that's already waiting for you, because some doors once opened lead to even deeper truths.